what are some additional rights for the employee? Number one on this page is the right to participate in decisions that affect them. And this is about democracy, right? If something's going to affect me, my voice matters. And we should hear from the people who are going to be most directly affected by the work, by a decision that we make. That participative style makes a big difference in company loyalty, if that's what you're looking for, as well as employee satisfaction and things like that. This is basic management 101. Participative management styles, generally speaking, are the better option for organizations. And so what are some of the steps that we have to do towards that? Well, number one, the company should make decisions with open communication, and it has to be transparent. The workers should make decisions about what affects them. The workers should make policies, decisions that affect the company. And so the, all of those things have to work together, right? It's like the company can make decisions in generally speaking, and the workers can make decisions about what affects them. It's like, I am going to be affected by this. This is what we believe we should do. The workers should be empowered to be able to do that. And the same thing with those policy decisions. And what view brings the democratic process into the workplace? We need to be considerate of that. And then, of course, this notion of participative management. All of these things are key to making sure that we've got democracy in the process. So the democratic process is usually a very transparent decision-making style. It's very behavioral and participative. Everyone's voice matters. And that's what that democratic process needs to look like. So the next thing is the right to due process versus employment at will. And these are put in contrast with each other because employment at will argues people can lose their job for any reason or no reason at all. The law states that if you're an at-will employee, it doesn't matter. You could be let go tomorrow as long as you're not violating certain laws and policies. Without getting into it in too much detail. But the right to due process argues, well, sure, we could do employment at will, but how about if we try to keep people, and if we try to keep them, we treat them fairly and we engage in due process. So we treat them with respect. We make sure we allow them the opportunity to have a fair and impartial hearing, that the rules are applied consistently, because when people are at will, while yes, employees could leave at any time if they choose to, employers, are more prone to abuse people and to get rid of them on a whim, right? And to just blow people off and not hold themselves accountable for bad behaviors. And it goes both ways, right? Because employees can leave and for bad behaviors, and we want to hold them accountable if they are doing bad things as well. But due process is so important. We want more than simply employment at will, where people can come and go as they want. And while you might argue from a utility perspective, this is a good thing. On the other hand, a lot of people don't have the ability to be as mobile as free will would argue, and economic free will would argue. So we do want to make sure that we are protecting those workers that need to be protected. Then we have the right to due process. And what does that basically mean for us? And as I said, we don't want to be terminated inappropriately. We want to make sure that people are handled well and fairly and kindly. So what are the arguments that support the employment at will? It's the notion of property rights. What I own, I can control. If you don't like it, you can leave, right? The freedom to contract, that I have the freedom to come and go. This notion of utilitarianism that says basically, I will engage till it doesn't meet my economic utility anymore, and then I'll move elsewhere, and vice versa for the employer. But again, as I said, people don't always have that kind of mobility and then have that flexibility and freedoms to move about as they want to. So we have to honor that. The right to due process is really what is up against, this notion of what is fair and right in terms of how do we handle the employment relationship. And we don't really want to be in a situation where people, don't feel like they have due process. So the right to work, the last point, the right to work is, it's actually articulated by the United Nations, that there's this intrinsic value to work and everybody should have the right to work. Now, you've probably heard it in the context of labor unions and union organizing, where there is a right to work for that people can have the right to work without being in a union, and that becomes very problematic because without a union to counterbalance a lot of management in manufacturing environments, we start to see abuses take place. But there are a lot of threats to just the ability to find a job and to work. And obviously, the pandemic was a big one, right? Technology, as technology advances, if people don't have the skill set to be able to understand what the new skills are, or if the new skills decrease the number of people we need to do work, because the technology removes the human element and the machines are replacing humans. As technology makes us more efficient, we need less workers. So this is a concern, of course. Then there's the problem with outsourcing jobs when we send jobs to other countries where we might be paying more than their living wage, but significantly less than we would pay here. Fair trade agreements also threaten the right to work, because then what happens is people will engage in fair trade and they will trade with other countries as opposed to doing business with companies in the United States itself. Um, Worker layoffs are also another aspect of a threat to the right to work, because obviously if the company is struggling financially, layoffs are typically one of the first things that they'll do. They will identify what they call redundancies and get rid of those people. And in some ways, these can make sense, and in a lot of ways, they often don't, because a lot of companies just start hacking people off and go, oh, I'll just do it with fewer people, without really strategically thinking why we need to get rid of some groups but not others. And then lastly, just general plant closings, because when plants close, for lack of work and lack of product to make and lack of resources, we lose jobs that way. So that is the biggest threats right now to right to work are those basic issues. So how do we protect, workers' moral rights overall? We want to make sure we give them advance notice when things are happening in the company, particularly things that are going to change the nature of the employment relationship, whether there's new technologies ahead or potential layoffs ahead. People need to know. We want to make sure that we give them severance pay to thank them for their contributions and to help them to make the transition to being unemployed. Making sure that they've got health benefits when they leave through things like COBRA, and stuff like that. Sometimes we can offer people early retirement programs, so that they will retire from their job, and then we don't have to worry about that anymore. We might transfer them to another location or another division, or do something different, retraining people to do something new. We can actually, if we're struggling with things, we can empower the employees to purchase the company, or to purchase taxes, purchase the company or purchase stock in the company. And then lastly, phasing out local taxes. I mean, if we can phase out, if you phase out local taxes, on the one hand, the local community suffers, but we protect worker rights. But then your community suffers because it doesn't have a tax base. So the roads start to fall apart and public services fall apart. It's a horrible cycle. There's no winning. Lastly is the employee's right to organize, and this has to do with their right to join a union, to be treated like they are human beings that have value just like anybody in the hierarchy of the organization, that they are free and equal. They have the right to call a strike. If they're not being treated fairly, they have the right to organize in a labor union, and to negotiate for their wages and working conditions. So there's a tremendous amount of informal power in an organization, and sort of how does it play into ethics, right? There are informal power relationships, and in people that build coalitions that can influence things, and we want to make sure that these coalitions are not harming people, and that these informal relationships um, are supporting and uplifting people and not undermining people and undermining, the structure of the company. So that's important. So there are different kinds of political tactics that people engage in. The bottom line is people are trying to do whatever it takes to protect their jobs, to protect their careers, to protect their territory. And so in essence, they will do whatever it takes to keep that. And that's where it becomes unethical, right? When we engage in illegal or inappropriate tactics to retain power for the sake of power rather than doing what it is best for the organization. And so when people bring in their own concerns about their own territory and their own egos, it really has a detrimental impact on the informal network in the company. And if everybody worked towards what is best to keep the company functioning and as many people working as possible, then you would do that in an ethical fashion, and politics wouldn't come to play. But what are some of the ethical considerations in politics? Obviously, there's the utilitarian question, right? Are the goals to be achieved by the tactics harmful or beneficial? And so, again, the greatest good for the greatest number, we consider that, from the perspective of, will these politics work? Do they matter? Well, it depends on the utility of them, right? Then there's the tactics. Are we treating people as a means to an end, and how does that impact moral rights? If we are treating people as a means to an end, if we're not treating people consistently and fairly, that would be considered unethical, right? Then the justice issues. Are we doing so to make sure there is a fair distribution of burdens and benefits and playing it out that way? And then lastly, what impact will the tactics have on the network, the relationships that we've built, the whole notion of the stakeholder analysis as we've talked about. And so there are what are some of the ways that we can look at the ethics of politics in our organization is really looking at moral rights, political means, making sure that we are treating everybody with respect and honoring their rights to privacy and freedom of consciousness and employment at will and the right to work and organize, giving them people fundamental right to earn money and to do that are important moral rights in this context. And it has to be balanced, of course, with how we use political means to achieve that. Um, and we want to make sure that we're looking at the justice and the fairness of the results and ensuring that we care, that there's an ethics of care in building those relationships. So at the end of the day, politics in the organization, it needs to be considered, it's an okay behavior to have if it meets the demands of all these ethical theories, that it is not using people, that it's creating more benefit than harm, that it's making sure that benefits are distributed fairly, and that we're building our network of relationships appropriately. So this table just goes over a whole host of different political tactics, blaming and attacking others, which is deflecting from taking responsibility for your own behaviors. It's very self-serving. Then it's about controlling information. You become a gatekeeper, and when you become a gatekeeper with information, that gives you power, but it's inappropriate power because your job is to share that information. But we often think that if we hold on to that information and we don't share it, that creates a more power for ourselves. And that I've seen people do that to great detriment to themselves in the long run because nobody's irreplaceable. Coalition building by getting a base of support for your ideas, and then image building, making sure that we're perceived to be kind or thoughtful or strong or powerful, and we cultivate our image and we do whatever it takes, even if it means using people to cultivate that image. Our last slide covers the caring organization and that network of relationships that we should be building, about having a caring connection and relationship with others to build an organization that demonstrates that care with its stakeholders in the community. And the characteristics of a caring organization is they make sure that those who make up their organization are taken care of, that the people are not a means to an end, and that the caring provided to them is not a means to an end to manipulate them in some way. Um, that the caring is subjective and that it is directed at individuals, that it's meaningful and intentional to people, and that the caring goals are to enhance growth and fulfill the employee's needs. And this is all good management practice. Again, when we engage in too much political behaviors that are detrimental to the organization, that can harm the company at all. So some of the key ethical issues are either caring too much, in which case you're too caught up in caring about people, which can stifle you, but also not caring enough either. So there's a fine line between the two that we need to engage in. So ethics of care basically compels us to make sure we are continually building caring relationships and that we put the relationship we have with others first.